Mornings in Plano always start the same way. The sun slowly creeps out from behind the horizon line, painting the sky a soft pink. I sit on the veranda with a cup of coffee, watching the occasional car and remembering how Margaret and I used to love those hours of quiet before the hectic day began. My name is Earl Clayton. I'm 67 years old and I've been a widower for 10 years. 10 long years without the woman with whom I lived soul to soul for 35 years. Sometimes I think I can still hear her laughter coming from the kitchen, or her light footsteps on the creaky floorboards. Margaret was the light of my life. Patient, kind, with a wonderful sense of humor and the ability to find joy in the simplest things. We moved to Plano when I was just starting out in the construction business. The small town in Texas seemed like the perfect place for a young family. Our only son, Danon, was born here. What a bright boy he was. Always with a book, always asking questions about how the world works. It's no wonder he chose to become an environmental engineer. Danon was passionate about making the world a cleaner place. My construction company was thriving. I specialized in green solutions for private homes when it wasn't yet a trend. By the time I retired, I had enough savings to ensure a peaceful old age. But my greatest treasure has always been this house, a 2-story house with a spacious veranda and a garden that Margaret cherished like a child. After her death from cancer, I sank into a void. Danon was my only support, my only reason to get up in the morning. He came every weekend, called almost every day. He was still single at the time, working for a large environmental company in Dallas, doing projects to clean up industrial areas. "Dad, you need to socialize more," he said. "Why don't you join a retirement club or reconnect with friends?" I nodded, but it made little difference. My interlocutors were the birds in the garden and old photo albums. That had all changed 4 years ago when Danon met Phoebe Throckmorton. He literally glowed as he talked about a yoga teacher with amazing energy and a special way of looking at the world. I was happy for my son and looked forward to meeting the girl who had so enchanted him. I remember our first meeting. Phoebe was attractive, slim, with long dark hair tied in a careless knot and eyes the color of green tea. But that same evening I felt a chill. Something in her gaze alerted me. She smiled, asked polite questions about my life, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. They remained attentive, assessing. "What a lovely house," she said then, looking around the living room. "And the grounds are so big. It must be hard to keep track of it all by yourself, huh?" There was something in her voice that made me tense. "I manage," I said. "Besides, the gardener comes once a week." The wedding was 6 months later, a modest ceremony in the botanical gardens. Danon was radiant with happiness. Phoebe smiled sweetly as she accepted congratulations. I presented them with a large check so they could make a down payment on a house of their own. "That's too generous, Dad," Danon said then. But I saw Phoebe's eyes sparkle at the sight of the check. To my surprise, the young couple didn't buy a separate place. Phoebe quickly found reasons why they should live with me. "Earl, it's environmentally friendly to share living space. Plus, you won't have to live alone, and we could save up for our dream house." Danon was in favor of the idea, and soon they were moving. Our spacious house suddenly became cramped. Phoebe brought a lot of knickknacks, her energy crystals and incense, the smell of which gave me a headache. But I tolerated it, seeing that my son was happy. With each passing month, however, I realized more and more clearly that I was the third extra in the house. Phoebe was never overtly rude. No, she acted more subtle. "Earl, could you keep the TV down? I'm teaching an online yoga class." "Earl, Danon and I would like to have dinner alone tonight." "Earl, your habit of getting up early is keeping us from getting a good night's sleep." Gradually, my life shrank like a shagreen skin. I began to use the common rooms less, leaving the house more often to stay out of the way. But it was my house, built with my own hands for my family. After about a year of living together, Danon noticed my condition. "Dad, is everything okay?" He asked me one evening when we were alone. Phoebe had left for a weekend seminar on spiritual practices. "Everything's fine, son," I replied, not wanting to drive a wedge between him and my wife. "You've been a little lost lately, and you're not using the living room much. It's still your home, you know." There was so much genuine concern in his voice that I almost told him the truth. But instead, I just kept it to generalities about just getting older and needing less space. Danon didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push it. After that conversation, however, I noticed him watching the interaction between Phoebe and me more closely. 2 years ago, I made a decision that seemed right at the time. I had signed the house over to Danon, with the sole condition of a lifetime residency for myself. It was my gift to my son, my support for his family. "Are you sure, Dad?" Danon asked when I informed him of my decision. "Absolutely. The house should belong to the young people. I don't need it." Danon hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. Phoebe's reaction, on the other hand, was restrained. She thanked me, but there was a calculating glint in her eyes that I didn't like. After the paperwork was done, I noticed that Phoebe became even more aloof with me. She no longer made any effort to maintain even the semblance of a warm relationship. I was now a guest in their home, not a member of the family. Danon continued to work at his company, often staying late into the night. I could see the tension gradually building between him and Phoebe. They began to talk less often, spending more time apart. Phoebe left more and more often for seminars and retreats, returning with strange ideas and new demands on the household. And then something happened that turned my life completely upside down. One ordinary Tuesday, 3 weeks ago, the phone rang. Danon had died of a heart attack right on the job. He was only 36 years old. The funeral was a blur. I stood at my boy's casket, unable to believe I had outlived my own child. It's wrong. It's against all the laws of nature. Parents shouldn't bury their children. Phoebe held herself aloof at the funeral. She wore a black dress and dark glasses, which she didn't take off even in church. I didn't see her cry. She spent most of the time socializing with her relatives, a thin woman introduced as her sister and a stern man she called uncle. After the ceremony, there was a memorial dinner at our, now her, house. People talked about Danon, reminiscing about how kind, smart, talented he was. I sat in the corner, unable to utter a word. Phoebe walked between the guests, accepting condolences, but never once came near me. The next week passed in a daze. I barely left my room, couldn't eat, had trouble falling asleep. Pictures of Danon's life flashed before my eyes. Here he was taking his first steps. Here he was walking to school with a huge backpack. Here he was getting his college diploma, glowing with pride. And here he is, being lowered into the ground, forever. Exactly a week after the funeral, Phoebe knocked on my door. I opened it and she came in uninvited, glancing around my room. "We need to talk, Earl," she said coldly, and I noticed that it was the first time she'd ever called me by my first name, not Mr. Clayton, as she had before. "Sure, Phoebe, sit down." She remained standing with her arms crossed over her chest. "I think we'd both be better off if you found another place to stay." I blinked, not believing my ears. "Excuse me?" "The house is mine now, as Danon's wife, and I want to live alone. You need to move out." I felt the blood rush from my face. "Phoebe, we just buried my son, your husband, and you're telling me this now?" She shrugged. "When? A month from now? A year from now?" It had to be said anyway. I own the house and I want to use it as I see fit. "But I have a life estate," I reminded him. "That was a condition when I signed over the house." Phoebe grinned. "The condition is no longer valid. I consulted a lawyer. You can sue, of course, but it's long and expensive, and I can make your life here very unpleasant. I looked at this woman my son once loved and didn't recognize her. Where had gone the sweet, smiling Phoebe who had won my boy's heart? "You have a week to move out," she said icily. "I've already contacted a real estate agent and they can show you some affordable retirement apartments." She turned and left the room, leaving me in a daze. 1 week. She's giving me a week to leave the house where my entire life has been spent, the house where I hold the memories of Margaret and Dannon. I sank down on the bed, feeling my heart pounding. The grief of losing my son was mixed with anger and powerlessness. Do I really have to leave? Is this really what Dannon would have wanted? I didn't sleep a wink that night. I lay staring at the ceiling and thought about my son, about our last conversation, about the way he looked worried and determined at the same time, the way he hugged me tighter than usual, as if he knew it would be the last time we'd see each other. The morning Phoebe left to teach her yoga class, I started packing up my most prized possessions and photos. Not because I was going to give up, but because I didn't trust this woman. I didn't know what she was capable of doing to get me out of the house. I pulled Margaret's old jewelry box from the dresser where I kept important documents, and then my eyes fell on an envelope that hadn't been there before. On it was written in Dannon's handwriting, "To Dad. Open if necessary." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a note from Dannon. I unfolded it and began to read. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. I hope you never open this envelope, but I need to back up. I've made arrangements with Wilton Paxton, an old friend of ours. Contact him immediately. He'll explain everything. And remember, whatever happens, I love you. Dannon." I reread the note several times, trying to make sense of it. Wilton Paxton had been our family lawyer since the days when I first started the construction business. He'd helped me with the paperwork when I'd signed the house over to Dannon. What could Wilton possibly know? I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't dialed in a couple years. Wilton answered after the third ring. "Earl, old buddy." His voice sounded warm, but with a hint of concern. "I was going to call you myself. My deepest condolences about Dannon. It's terrible." "Thank you, Wilton." My voice sounded hoarse. "I found a note from my son. He said to get in touch with you." There was a long pause. "Then it's time," Wilton sighed. "We need to meet, Earl. The sooner the better." We agreed to meet in an hour at his office. I walked out of the house trying not to make any noise. I was shaking with the anticipation of something important, the hope that my son had left me more than just a goodbye note. Wilton's office was in a small, historic building in downtown Plano. The receptionist, who had known me for many years, smiled sadly and immediately ushered me into the office. Wilton, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and kind eyes behind glasses, stood to meet me. "Earl, old friend," he shook my hand firmly. "Have a seat." I sank into the leather chair across from his desk, feeling my heart pounding. "What's going on, Wilton? What did Dannon know that he left me that note?" Wilton sighed and opened his desk drawer. From there he pulled out a file folder. "About a month and a half ago, Dannon came to see me. He was concerned and determined at the same time, said he wanted to deed the house back to you." I felt out of breath. "What? But why?" "He didn't go into details, but he said he was worried about your future. Mentioned that his marriage was going through a rough patch, and he wanted to make sure you were safe no matter what happened." Wilton opened the folder and pulled out a document with official seals. "Here's the deed of gift, Earl. It's all legal, notarized. The house belongs to you again." Dannon insisted that the procedure be expedited and quiet. He said he'd tell you everything himself when the time came. I took the documents with shaky hands and tried to read the legal text, but the letters blurred before my eyes. Did he say anything else? About Phoebe? About their relationship? Wilton adjusted his glasses and looked at me carefully. "I'm a lawyer, Earl, and I'm bound by professional ethics. But as your friend, I'll tell you this. Dannon was very concerned. He mentioned that Phoebe had changed, that she— Wilton hesitated, searching for words. That she wasn't the woman he thought he'd married. I leaned back in my chair, trying to comprehend what I'd heard. Memories of the last months of my son's life flashed before my eyes. A lot of things made sense now. Danon had really changed about 2 months before he died. More withdrawn, thoughtful. He stayed late at work more often. I put it down to fatigue and work problems, but now I realize it was deeper than that. I remembered our conversation a week before he died. We were sitting on the porch, Phoebe away on another seminar. Danon was drinking a beer and staring at nothing. "Dad," he said suddenly, "do you ever feel like you've made a mistake, but it's too late to make a change?" "Of course, son," I replied. "Everyone makes mistakes. The question is how you deal with them." He paused, twirling the bottle in his hands. "What if the mistake affects not only you, but other people as well? If you let down the ones you love?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "Danon, what's going on? You can tell me everything." He opened his mouth as if he was going to say something, but then he shook his head. "Nothing, Dad. Just thinking out loud. Never mind." The next day, I caught him talking on the phone. He was talking quietly, but tensely. "No, I can't just walk away. Yes, I understand the risks. We need to do this right, legally." Seeing me, he quickly ended the conversation and smiled a strained smile. Now, sitting in Wilton's office, I realized that Danon had probably been planning the divorce even then, and was worried about me, about what would happen to me afterward. "Earl," Wilton's voice brought me back to reality. "There's something else you need to know." Danon left a video message in case something happened to him before he explained everything to you. He was very insistent that I only give it to him in the event of his absence. Wilton pulled out a flash drive and held it out to me. "This is a copy. I keep the original in my safe. I'd suggest you watch it in my office if you're up for it." I nodded, feeling a lump come up in my throat. Wilton turned on the computer, inserted the flash drive, and turned the monitor toward me. After a few seconds, Danon's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired but determined. "Hey, Dad, if you're watching this video, it means something went wrong and I wasn't able to tell you everything in person. I hope it won't be necessary, but I have to back it up." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that always gave away his nervousness. "I signed the house back over to you. Not because you asked or hinted. You would never do that. I did it because I realized what a mistake I'd made in tying my life to Phoebe." He sighed heavily. "The last few months I've discovered a lot of things I hadn't noticed or didn't want to notice before. Phoebe isn't who I thought she was. She's self-serving, and her attitude towards you. That was the final straw. I heard her tell her sister on the phone that the old man will be in a nursing home soon, and I laughed. She doesn't even know I heard that conversation." My heart clenched with pain, not at Phoebe's words, but at what my son was going through. "I started divorce proceedings, Dad, secretly consulted with lawyers. But before I told her, I wanted to make sure you were protected. That's why I rewrote the house. Wilton will help you if there's a problem. All the paperwork is in order, the deed of gift is legal, and there's nothing Phoebe can do about it." Danon smiled sadly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want to worry you. You've been through enough since Mom left. But know that I'm grateful for everything you taught me, the values you instilled in me. They're what helped me see the truth." He was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I love you, Dad, and I know I'm doing the right thing." That was the end of the video. I sat there, unable to move, feeling tears running down my cheeks. My boy, my smart, kind boy. "He wrote it down 2 weeks before he died," Wilton said quietly. Danon had indeed started divorce proceedings. He consulted with a colleague of mine who specializes in family law, gathered evidence of some of Phoebe's bad behavior. What kind of behavior? I asked hoarsely. Wilton shook his head. He didn't go into detail with me. All he said was that it was about financial fraud and possibly infidelity. He was very upset, Earl. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing in my head. My son was hurting, preparing for a divorce, worrying about me, and he kept it all to himself so he wouldn't worry me. And now he's gone. His heart couldn't take all that stress. What do I do now, Wilton? My old friend straightened up in his chair. Legally, the house is all yours. The deed of gift is immaculate. All the taxes are paid. Phoebe can't challenge it unless she can prove that Danon was incapacitated when he signed it, which is impossible, since he was medically cleared the same day. I insisted on it myself, anticipating the potential problems. She's already told me to move out in a week. So, she doesn't know about the deed of gift yet. Wilton pursed his lips. I wouldn't be surprised if she was planning to sell the house as soon as you left. What do we do now? Show her the deed, the sooner the better. And be prepared for a storm, Earl. I nodded, feeling oddly calm. It was like Danon was standing right next to me now, putting his hand on my shoulder. I can handle it, I said. Wilton gave me a certified copy of the deed of gift and a few other documents to prove my ownership. We agreed that he would represent me if necessary. I got home in the evening. Phoebe was sitting in the living room leafing through a magazine. She looked up when I arrived, and I could see the impatience in her eyes. Had you started packing? She asked without saying hello. I made my way to the chair opposite and sat down, placing the file folder on my lap. No, Phoebe, I'm not going anywhere. She set the magazine aside, her face tense. We've already discussed this, Earl. The house is mine, and I want you to move out. I slowly opened the folder and pulled out the deed of gift. I'm afraid you're wrong, Phoebe. The house belongs to me. Here are the deeds. I held out the papers to her. She frowned, took them, and began to read them. I watched her expression change from bewilderment to shock, from shock to rage. What is this? Her voice trembled. It's a forgery. Danon would never... It's a legal document, Phoebe. Danon signed the house back over to me a month and a half ago. It's all legal, notarized. She jumped up. The papers fell out of her hands. You forced him, manipulated him. He would never... I didn't know anything about it until today, I replied calmly. Danon did it on his own initiative, and left a video message explaining his reasons. Phoebe turned pale. She knew my son well enough to know that he could have anticipated this situation and prepared for it. It's not true, she whispered, but without the same confidence. It is true, Phoebe, and you know it. Danon realized who you really are. He started divorce proceedings before he died. She stared at me wide-eyed. Then she grabbed the documents off the floor and began to frantically reread them, as if hoping to find some mistake, some loophole. I'll argue it, she finally said. I'll prove that he was out of it, that you pressured him. Danon was medically cleared the day he signed, I replied. Everything was done legally, subject to any claims you might have. Phoebe clenched her fists so white her knuckles turned white. You're not getting this house, man. I'm gonna sue. I'll prove that you manipulated my son. It's up to you, I shrugged. But until the court rules, the house belongs to me, and I'm not moving out. She stared at me with such hatred that I could almost physically feel it. You're going to regret this, Earl Clayton, she hissed. I swear you'll regret it. With those words, she threw the papers in my face, turned, and ran out of the room. I heard the front door slam, and then her car started and drove off with a screech of tires. I remained seated in the chair, picking up the scattered papers. A strange calm filled me. I wasn't afraid of Phoebe's threats. My son had taken care of me even after his death. His last gift was protection from the woman who had caused him so much pain. I stood up and walked over to the picture of Danon that stood on the mantelpiece. In it, He was smiling that open, genuine smile that had appeared less and less often in recent years. "Thank you, son," I whispered, touching my fingers to the glass. "I won't let you down." That night was the first time I'd had a decent dinner since Danon's death. Then I sat on the veranda for a long time, looking up at the stars and remembering our life with Margaret, Danon's birth, his first steps, his first words. Remembering how we'd built birdhouses for the garden together, how we'd taught him to ride his bike, how proud we'd been of his success in school. My whole life flashed before my eyes like a movie. Phoebe never came home that night. I didn't know where she was or what she was planning, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like a master in my own home, and I knew that whatever trials awaited me in the coming days and weeks, I would make it through, for my son's memory, for our family. Phoebe returned the next day toward evening. I heard her enter the house, slamming the door. From my room, I watched as she went upstairs to her and Danon's bedroom and soon came down with a small bag of things. She gave me a searing look but didn't say a word. The door slammed, the engine roared, and she disappeared again. I thought it would give me a break, but I was wrong. The very next day, the phone started ringing, first my cell phone, then my home phone. Neighbors, Danon's friends, even a few of my old buddies in the construction business. "Earl, is it true you forged the documents after Danon died?" Gordon Malloy, my neighbor on my right with whom we sometimes played chess, asked. "Clayton, I'm sorry to say this, but Phoebe says terrible things about you in the congregation," reported Martha Lewis, an elderly lady from the church choir where Margaret once sang. "Mr. Clayton, I think you should know that your sister-in-law is accusing you of real estate fraud. Even Peter Howard, the father of Danon's classmate whom we hadn't spoken to in 20 years, called. I patiently explained to everyone that the paperwork was legitimate, that Danon himself, in his right mind, had signed the house back over to me. Some believed, others doubted. But I could feel the web of rumor and speculation weaving around me. On the fourth day after our confrontation with Phoebe, I found an official letter in my mailbox from the law firm of Sterling, Bronson and Associates. They notified me that they were representing Phoebe Clayton. She continued to use my son's last name, and that she was challenging the validity of the house deed, claiming that the document had been signed when Danon was under severe emotional stress and unable to make informed decisions. I immediately called Wilton and read him the letter. "It was expected," he sighed. "Come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss defense strategy." The next day I sat across from Wilton, in the same chair I had sat in a few days earlier when I first learned of my son's behavior. "Their case is weak," Wilton said, looking over the papers. "We have a medical report on Danon's capacity at the time of signing, and we have witnesses to the signing, myself and my secretary Doris. There's a video message where Danon clearly explains the reasons for his decision, and most importantly, there's the deed of gift, which is in order." "But they're still suing?" Wilton shrugged. "It's a pressure tactic, Earl. Phoebe's hoping you'll be scared of the court, the expense, the publicity, and agree to some kind of settlement, maybe selling the house and splitting the proceeds." I shook my head. "That house is all I have left of my family, Wilton. I'm not giving it up." "That's right," he nodded. "We'll prepare a response to their lawyers. In the meantime, I suggest you gather anything that might indicate Phoebe's character and intentions. Any documents, letters, maybe tapes of conversations. Anything that shows her true colors. I came home determined to find anything that might help in the battle ahead. I started with Danon's belongings, which I still couldn't bring myself to sort through. His office, a small room on the first floor, was still as it had been when he was alive. A computer, stacks of papers, pictures on the walls, mostly of the nature he so loved to protect, and a few of our family photos. There were surprisingly few pictures of Phoebe. I started with the desk drawers. The top one held the usual office supplies, bills, receipts. In the second were folders of work papers, the land reclamation projects he was so proud of. And in the bottom, locked drawer, which I opened with a spare key I'd kept since the days when I'd helped assemble this desk, I found a leather notebook. It was Danon's journal. I never knew my son kept a diary. He had always been secretive about his most private thoughts and feelings. I hesitated, not knowing if I had the right to read these entries. But then I remembered Wilton's words about the need to gather evidence, and that Danon seemed to have foreseen the situation I was now in. With a heavy heart, I opened the journal and began to read. The first entries were dated about a year earlier and were mostly about work. Danon wrote about the problems with the river cleanup project, the bureaucracy, his fatigue. Occasionally he mentioned Phoebe, mostly in passing, without much emotion. Phoebe's away again for the weekend for a seminar. Phoebe wants to change her car even though the current one is in great condition. Had an argument with Phoebe about my delay at work. But the closer the entries got to the present, the more space the marriage problems took up. Found out today that Phoebe withdrew $3,000 from our joint account without warning. When I asked, she said it was for a refresher course for yoga instructors. But I saw the statement. The money went into some Gabriel Nook's account. Who's that? Phoebe's been criticizing Dad more and more. She says he takes up too much space in the house, that his habits annoy her. Today she said outright that she'll breathe easier when he moves out. I reminded her that I own the house, and the condition of the transfer was that Dad lived there for life. She just snorted and walked away. Overheard Phoebe talking to her sister by chance. She was saying that the old man is ruining her life and that after I die, the first thing she'll do is kick him out the door. After I die, as if she was already planning my funeral. It made me cringe. What is happening to the woman I loved? And finally, the last entry, dated the very day Wilton says Danon executed the deed of gift. Went to Wilton's today. Signed the house back over to my father. Can't risk his welfare. Phoebe's not who I thought she was. Found proof of her connection to Gabriel, several months of deception, and her financial fraud, withdrawing money from our accounts, spending it on him, some dubious investments. When I asked about Gabriel directly, she denied it, called me paranoid. But I saw their texts, their meetings on her phone calendar. I started divorce proceedings, but before I tell her, I need to protect my dad. He's already lost his mom. I'm not going to let him lose the house as well. I closed the journal, feeling a lump rise to my throat. My boy had suffered, struggled with betrayal, tried to protect me all alone, not wanting to disturb me. And then his heart gave out. I carefully put the diary back in the drawer. It wasn't just evidence for the trial. It was my son's final testimony of love. And I couldn't let his last will be broken. That same day, I decided to contact Danon's colleague, Rory Balcom. My son had often mentioned him as a close friend from work. Maybe he knew something more? It wasn't hard to find Rory's number. It was listed in Danon's contacts on his home computer. I dialed the number, mentally preparing myself for an awkward conversation. Rory Balcom speaking, a cheerful male voice answered. Hello, Mr. Balcom. This is Earl Clayton, Danon's father. There was a pause. Mr. Clayton, my deepest condolences. Danon was a wonderful man and friend. Thank you, Rory. I'm calling because I need to know something about the last weeks of my son's life. It's important. Of course, anything I can do to help. I took a deep breath. Did Danon ever talk to you about problems in his marriage? About Phoebe? Pause again. Longer. Mr. Clayton, I'm not sure I should. Please, Rory. I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. Phoebe is trying to challenge Danon's last will and testament, and I need to defend myself. Another pause, then a sigh. Yes, he's been talking, especially in the last few months. He's been, very upset. What exactly did he say? That he discovered her infidelity with some spiritual instructor, Gabriel, that she was spending their joint money on him, on some dubious seminars and investments, and that she, wasn't very nice to you. Did he mention the divorce? Yes. Rory's voice grew quieter. He was consulting with lawyers, gathered evidence. He was very methodical about it, as he was about everything, and very worried about you, about how it would affect you. Did he say anything about the house? Yeah. He said he'd signed it back over to you to protect it from Phoebe. I even talked him out of it at first, suggested he wait until after the divorce. But he was adamant. Said he couldn't take the risk, that he had to make sure you were safe no matter what happened. I covered my eyes, feeling a new wave of gratitude for my son. Thank you, Rory. That's very helpful. If it becomes necessary, would you be willing to testify in court? Of course, Mr. Clayton. Anything for Danon. He was my best friend. One more question, Rory. Do you know anything about Danon's diary? The diary? Rory sounded surprised. Oh, you mean his leather notebook? Yeah, he was always carrying it around, making notes in it, especially lately. I once asked him jokingly if he was writing a novel, and he said seriously, "No, I just want to make sure the truth doesn't get lost." After talking to Rory, I decided to go through Danon's diary again, more carefully. And I discovered something I hadn't noticed on my first cursory reading. There was a secret pocket in the back cover, and in it was a flash drive and a note. Copies of all evidence. I turned on the computer and inserted the flash drive. On it were folders of files, neatly sorted by date. Screenshots of correspondence between Phoebe and someone named Gabriel, photos of their meetings, apparently taken by Danon himself or a private investigator he'd hired, bank statements showing strange transactions, and most shocking of all, audio recordings of Phoebe's conversations with her sister and this Gabriel. I opened one of the audio files and heard Phoebe's voice. It's just the old man getting on my nerves, always walking around with his mournful look, reminiscing about his wife, like he's the only one who's lost a loved one. And the house is in Danon's name only on the condition that his daddy can live there until he dies. Can you believe that? He could live another 20 years. 20 years I have to put up with him in our house. Sister's voice. What does Danon say? Danon adores his daddy. Thinks he's the wisest man in the world. It's making me sick. But that's okay. I'm slowly building tension between them. And then, when the time comes... What are you talking about, Phoebe? A chuckle. Nothing in particular, sis. It's just that Earl isn't getting any younger, and old people belong in nursing homes. And if he suddenly becomes incapacitated... I turned off the tape, feeling myself flush with anger. Now I understood why Danon had been so concerned, why he'd been in such a hurry to get the house reissued. I gathered up all the materials I'd found, the diary, the flash drive, printed out the most important documents and called Wilton. I found proof, I said. A lot of evidence. Good, Wilton sounded pleased. Bring it back tomorrow. My team and I will review the material and prepare to meet with Phoebe's lawyers. Does she know what we found? Not yet, and it's best she doesn't until she does. The element of surprise could play right into our hands. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Thoughts of Danon, of his suffering, of Phoebe's betrayal. I couldn't rest. I went out onto the veranda where my son and I often sat, talking about everything. The stars shone brightly in the Texas night sky. I won't let you down, son, I thought as I looked at the constellations that Danon so loved to show me. Your final gift will not be in vain. The next morning, as I was about to take the materials to Wilton, I got a call from Martha Lewis, the lady from the church choir. Earl, honey, I have to warn you. Phoebe's been going around the neighborhood saying horrible things. That you forced Danon to sign the papers, that you threatened to evict them both if he didn't agree, that you took advantage of his illness. Sickness? I interjected. What are you talking about, Martha? She claims that Danon was depressed, that he was taking strong antidepressants that were affecting his judgment, and that you took advantage of that. I felt anger boiling up inside me. Danon had never suffered from depression, never taken antidepressants. It was a pure lie. Martha, it's not true. Danon didn't have any mental problems. He was completely healthy and capable. That's what I thought, Martha sighed. But Phoebe is very persuasive, and she's hired a lawyer from a big firm in Dallas. She came to see me this morning with some young man, asking me to sign a witness statement about your strange behavior after Margaret's death. I, of course, declined. But I'm afraid not all the neighbors will be so squeamish. I thanked Martha for the warning and immediately called Wilton, telling him about Phoebe's new tactics. It's to be expected, he said. She's trying to create an image of a sick, manipulative Danon and an image of an angry, manipulative you. Classic tactic in a case like this. But we have a medical report and a video message from Danon. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to his attending physician. Of course, I said. Dr. Verwick, he's been seeing Danon since he was a kid. Oh, that's great. Doctors don't usually like to testify, but in a case like this, when it comes to slandering a patient, he might make an exception. We agreed to meet in an hour, but before I could leave the house, the doorbell rang. There was a young man in a business suit carrying a briefcase. Mr. Clayton, my name is Corey Danner. I represent Mrs. Phoebe Clayton. Here's the subpoena and a copy of the lawsuit. He handed me the envelope and, without waiting for an answer, turned and walked away. I opened the envelope. Phoebe's suit sought to invalidate the deed of gift on the grounds that Danon had allegedly been heavily medicated and psychologically pressured by me. She claimed that I had manipulated my son by taking advantage of his emotional vulnerability and dependence on me. Reading these absurd accusations, I felt not so much anger as deep sadness. Would this woman so sully my son's memory, so distort our relationship, just to get a house? I carefully folded the papers back into the envelope and left the house. Ahead of me was a meeting with Wilton, court preparation, and an uphill battle for my son's legacy. On the way to Wilton, I reflected on how strangely life turns. Just a month ago, I had a son, a family, a home where I felt, if not welcome, at least tolerated. Now my son is gone, and I'm at war with the woman he once loved. But I was not alone in this war. Danon, even in death, stood by me. His journal, his foresight, his love gave me the strength to move on. The trial was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. I got up at 5, unable to lie in bed any longer. I was as nervous as a schoolboy before an exam. Wilton picked me up at 8:30 so we could go over the defense strategy one more time. Don't worry, Earl, he reassured me as we drove to the Plano County Courthouse. We have a solid case. The deed of gift is impeccable, and all the witnesses are on our side. But Phoebe seems to be willing to do anything, I objected. Who knows what witnesses she's found and what they'll say about me and Danon? That's what cross-examination is for. Wilton patted my shoulder. Don't worry about it too much. The courthouse greeted us with cool, air-conditioned air and the hum of voices. We went up to the second floor and took seats in the courtroom. Phoebe was already there, with her attorney, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a predatory look. She sat with her back straight, dressed in a strict black suit with an expression of offended innocence on her face. I looked toward the doors, expecting to see our witnesses. Rory Balcom was due to arrive right at the start of the session, and Dr. Verwick had promised to come as soon as he was free from his morning appointment. Wilton assured me that both would certainly be there. At precisely 10 o'clock, the judge entered the room, a plump man of about 50, with a good-natured face and shrewd eyes. He introduced himself as Judge Robert Hollingsworth and announced the beginning of the hearing in the case of Clayton v. Clayton. The first to speak was Phoebe's attorney, who introduced himself as Miles Bronson of Sterling, Bronson and Associates. "Your Honor," he began in a confident voice, "my client, Mrs. Phoebe Clayton, has recently suffered a terrible tragedy, the death of her beloved husband, Dannon Clayton. No sooner had she recovered from this blow than she discovered that her father-in-law, Mr. Earl Clayton, was claiming rights to the house where the young family had lived, claiming that shortly before his death, his son had signed the property over to him." Bronson paused, looking around the room. "We intend to prove that the so-called deed of gift, if it exists at all, was signed under duress when Dannon Clayton was under severe emotional stress, possibly under the influence of powerful medications and not fully aware of his actions. In addition, we believe that Mr. Earl Clayton took advantage of his son's vulnerable state and manipulated him using his parental authority." I felt anger boiling up inside me, but Wilton put a hand on my shoulder warningly, urging me to remain calm. "We will present testimony from family acquaintances that, in the last months of his life, Dannon Clayton was depressed, suffered from depression, and often complained of pressure from his father," Bronson continued. "We will also provide evidence that Mr. Earl Clayton repeatedly expressed his displeasure with his son's marriage and tried to turn him against his wife." I gritted my teeth. Every word this man said was a lie. But Wilton was right. Our turn would come. After the opening statement, Bronson called the first witness, a middle-aged woman he introduced as Helen Dorset, Phoebe and Dannon's neighbor. "Mrs. Dorset, how long have you known the Clayton family?" About 3 years. My husband and I moved to the same street when the young Claytons were already living there." "What did you find the relationship between Dannon and his father to be like in the final months before Dannon's tragic passing?" Helen adjusted her glasses and cast me an apologetic glance. They seemed tense. "Dannon often looked upset after visits from his father or phone conversations with him. Did Dannon ever tell you that his father was pressuring him?" "Objection, Your Honor," Wilton jumped in. "That's a leading question." "Sustained," the judge nodded. "Mr. Bronson, rephrase the question. Did Dannon ever discuss his relationship with his father with you?" "Not directly, but one day when my husband and I invited Dannon and Phoebe over for a barbecue, Dannon was particularly depressed. Phoebe explained that he'd had a difficult conversation with his father about the house, something about how Mr. Clayton Sr. considered the house still his, even though he'd formally signed it over to his son. I looked over at Phoebe, who was sitting with a perfectly straight back, staring in front of me with an expression of sorrow on her face. What an actress! Phoebe's 2 other witnesses gave similar testimony, creating an image of an oppressive, manipulative father and an unhappy, depressed son. It was all the exact opposite of the truth, and I could barely restrain myself from jumping up and screaming about it. Finally, Bronson finished introducing his witnesses, and the floor went to Wilton. "Your Honor," he began, rising from his seat, "my colleagues have painted a very dramatic picture, which, unfortunately, has nothing to do with reality. We are going to present you with the real facts today, backed up not by speculation and rumors, but by concrete evidence and testimony from people who knew Dannon Clayton intimately." He paused, giving the words a chance to reach the judge. "The first witness I would like to call is Dr. Oliver Verwick, the Claytons' family physician who has observed Dannon since he was a child." Dr. Verwick, an elderly man with a neat gray beard and kind eyes, made his way to the witness stand. After the oath was administered, Wilton began his questioning. "Dr. Verwick, how long had you known Dannon Clayton?" "Since he was born. I was the Claytons' family physician for over 35 years. When was the last time you saw Dannon before he died?" 2 weeks before he passed. He came in for a routine checkup." "What was his physical and mental condition?" "Physically, he was in great shape for his age. His blood pressure was normal, his labs were fine. Mentally, he was collected, focused, adequate. I didn't see any signs of depression or anxiety. Did you ever prescribe Danon antidepressants or other psychotropic medications? Never. It wasn't necessary. Thank you, doctor. One more question. About a month before Danon's death, you conducted a medical evaluation of Danon's competency. Could you tell the court about that? Dr. Verwick nodded. Yes. Danon asked me to do a complete medical examination and evaluation of his mental state. Said it was necessary for some legal formalities. I did the standard procedure and issued a report that he was fully competent, of sound mind and memory, free from any influences that might impair his ability to make informed decisions. Thank you, doctor. No further questions. Bronson rose to cross-examine, but quickly realized that the testimony of a professional with years of experience would be difficult to undermine. He limited himself to a few formal questions and let the doctor go. The next witness Wilton called was Rory Balcom. A young man with a short haircut and an honest, open face walked briskly to the witness stand. Mr. Balcom, what was your relationship with Danon Clayton? We were colleagues and close friends. Worked together at Ecotech Solutions for the last 6 years. How would you characterize his condition in the last months of his life? Rory thought for a moment. He was troubled, that's for sure, but not in the sense that is trying to be portrayed here. Danon wasn't concerned about his relationship with his father, but about his marriage. There was silence in the room. Phoebe visibly tensed. What exactly was bothering him? He discovered that his wife was cheating on him, with some spiritual practice instructor, and that she was spending their joint money on this man. There was a whisper in the room. Phoebe whispered something fiercely in her lawyer's ear. Did Danon share his plans for the future with you? Yes. He was planning a divorce, consulting lawyers, gathering evidence of Phoebe's infidelity and financial fraud, and he was very concerned about his father. What do you mean? Worried? Danon said that Phoebe hated his father, considered him a nuisance, and wanted him out of the house. He was afraid that once the divorce proceedings started, she'd retaliate, including through his father. That's why he decided to sign the house back over. Did he tell you about this decision? Yes. He told me directly that he'd signed over the deed to his father. I even discouraged him at first, told him to wait until after the divorce. But Danon was adamant. He said he had to be sure his father would be all right, no matter what happened. Bronson jumped up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. These are all unsubstantiated allegations. We have no proof that such conversations actually took place. Your Honor, Wilton replied calmly, we do have such evidence. With the court's permission, I would like to introduce Danon Clayton's personal diary, discovered by his father after his son's death. The judge nodded and Wilton handed the diary to the bailiff. In this diary, Wilton continued, Danon details his deteriorating relationship with his wife, his suspicions later confirmed of her infidelity and financial fraud, and his decision to sign the house back over to his father to protect him. The judge went through the diary carefully, lingering on the bookmarked pages. The court accepts the diary as evidence, he finally said. Mr. Bronson, you may continue to cross-examine the witness. Bronson, clearly knocked out, began asking Rory questions in an attempt to undermine his credibility with the court. Weren't he and Danon just drinking buddies? Was he not exaggerating the closeness of their friendship? Did he have no personal grudge against Phoebe? Rory answered calmly and confidently, not giving in to provocation. After his questioning, Wilton called me as a witness. Sitting on the witness stand, I talked about our relationship with our son, how he had changed in recent months, the conversation on the veranda, how I had found the diary and the flash drive with the evidence. Mr. Clayton, Wilton asked, have you ever pressured your son to sign the house back over to you? Never, I answered firmly. I did not even know of his intentions until I received the deeds from you after his death. Did you ever express any dissatisfaction with his marriage to Phoebe? No. I wanted my son to be happy. If he had been happy with Phoebe, I would have been only too happy. Wilton nodded. What else did you find among your son's belongings besides the diary? A thumb drive with the evidence he'd collected for the divorce proceedings. There were screenshots of Phoebe's correspondence with her lover, photos of their meetings, bank statements, and audio recordings of Phoebe discussing how to get rid of me and take over the house. Your Honor, I would like to present this evidence to the court, Wilton said, handing the judge a flash drive and printouts of key materials. As the judge studied the evidence presented, I looked at Phoebe. She had turned pale and was frantically whispering something to her attorney, who looked increasingly worried. The court accepts these materials as evidence, Judge Hollingsworth said. Mr. Bronson, your cross-examination. Bronson, clearly unprepared for this turn of events, asked me several questions about my relationship with Phoebe, trying to portray me as a jealous father-in-law, not ready to share his son with his daughter-in-law. But his questions sounded unconvincing, especially in the face of the evidence presented. After my testimony, Wilton called the last witness, himself. He recounted how Danon had come to him asking him to execute the deed of gift, how he had insisted on a medical examination to eliminate any doubt about his capacity, and how he had left a video message in the event of his death. Your Honor, I would like to present this video message to the court, Wilton said, handing the judge another flash drive. A screen was set up, and everyone in the room saw Danon, pale but determined, explaining his motives, his concern for me, his disappointment in his wife, and his decision. There was silence in the room after the video was viewed. Phoebe lowered her head, her shoulders shaking, whether from sobs or rage. Mr. Bronson, the judge addressed Phoebe's lawyer, do you have any questions for the witness? Bronson rose slowly. No, Your Honor. In that case, I will recess the court to review all the evidence presented. The trial will resume in 2 weeks, same time. He struck the gavel, and the session was adjourned. As I left the courtroom, I noticed Phoebe saying something vehemently to her attorney. She threw me a hateful look and quickly walked out the side door. It went even better than I expected, Wilton said as we left the courthouse. The judge is clearly impressed with our evidence. I'm pretty sure the ruling will be in our favor. Thank you, old friend. I shook his hand. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank your son, Earl. He's got it all figured out. We agreed to meet in a few days to discuss further strategy, and we went home. That evening, I got a call from Wilton. Earl, I just got word that Phoebe fired Bronson. Apparently, she's looking for a new lawyer or dropping the suit altogether. Is that good news? More like cautiously optimistic, but I'd advise you to be especially careful in the coming days. Phoebe's backed into a corner which makes her unpredictable. What do you mean? She may try to, get or destroy some evidence. Do you have an alarm system in your house? No, never needed one. I'd recommend at least a rudimentary security camera, for your own safety and in case she tries to break in while you're away. I thought about Danon's diary, the evidence flash drive, the video message. We had copies of all that stuff, but I kept the originals at home. Okay, Wilton, I'll get on it tomorrow. The next day, I bought a set of wireless surveillance cameras from a local electronics store and installed them at the front door, the back door, and in the hallway leading to Danon's office where all the documents were kept. The cameras were connected to my smartphone and I could see what was going on in the house at any moment. 3 days passed. Phoebe hadn't shown up, and I was beginning to think Wilton's fears were in vain. Perhaps she had simply decided to drop the suit and seek happiness elsewhere. That evening I was to meet Wilton in town to discuss some details of our defense. As I left the house, I double-checked to make sure the doors were locked, and I took Danon's journal and flash drive with me just in case. Wilton and I had dinner at a small restaurant and discussed the upcoming meeting. He was confident of our victory, but still advised us to be prepared for the unexpected. Returning home around 9 p.m., I received a notification from the surveillance camera app. Traffic detected at the back door. I parked around the corner and opened the app. The screen clearly showed Phoebe trying to open the back door with some kind of lockpick-like tool. I immediately called the police and reported the attempted break-in. Then I called Wilton. "You were right," I said. "She's trying to break into the house." I called the police. "Stay where you are," Wilton advised. "Don't confront her. Let the police handle it." I sat in the car, watching through the app as Phoebe finally managed the lock and entered the house. The cameras showed her walking quickly through the kitchen, looking around and heading straight for Danon's office. There she began frantically rummaging through desk drawers and cabinets, throwing papers and books around. A few minutes later, the police arrived, 2 officers in a patrol car with blinkers. I got out of my car and approached them, explaining the situation. We walked up to the house together. One of the officers knocked on the door. "Plano Police! Open up!" There was a rumble inside as if something had fallen. A few seconds later, the door opened and Phoebe appeared on the doorstep, disheveled and clearly frightened. "What is it, officer?" "Ma'am, we've had a report of trespassing in this house," the policeman said. "This is my house," Phoebe exclaimed. "I used to live here with my husband." "The house belongs to me," I said calmly, showing the papers I'd always carried with me since this story started. "And I have a videotape of this woman breaking in the back door." The officers looked at each other. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us to the station to testify." Phoebe went pale. "You have no right. This is a misunderstanding. I just came to get my things." "Through the back door, with a lockpick?" said the second officer who was examining the door. "And why were you in the study and not in the bedroom where your things should be?" Phoebe started to mumble something, but the officers had already locked the handcuffs on her wrists and were reading her rights. "Can you send me the video of the break-in?" the first officer asked me. "Sure," I nodded. "They're stored in the cloud. I'll send them right away." The cops led Phoebe away, who glared at me fiercely over her shoulder. I entered the house and looked around the study. Papers were strewn everywhere. Books had been thrown off the shelves, drawers pulled out. It was obvious she was looking for the journal and the flash drive, but she couldn't find them because I had them with me. I called Wilton and told him what had happened. "Great," he said. "It's another nail in the coffin of her lawsuit. Trespassing, attempted destruction of evidence. The judge will be thrilled." The next morning, I went to the police station to give a formal statement about the break-in. The officer taking the statement said Phoebe had spent the night in a cell and was released on bail in the morning. She faces charges of trespassing and attempted theft or destruction of personal property. "Do you want to proceed with the case?" the officer asked. "Or are you ready to withdraw the plea?" I thought of Danon, of his suffering, of his last will. "Continue," I said firmly. "This is not just a hack. This is an attempt to destroy my son's memory and devalue his last will." The officer nodded understandingly and continued filling out the paperwork. When I returned home, I found another letter from the lawyers, this time from a new firm, Jameson, Frost and Company. They advised that they were now representing Phoebe Clayton in a contested deed of gift case and asked that the next court hearing be postponed to a later date due to the need to review the case file. I gave the letter to Wilton, and he said, "This is a standard delaying tactic. They realize they were losing and now they're trying to buy time," he explained. "Maybe they're hoping you'll get tired and settle, or that some evidence will disappear, witnesses will change their minds. But we're not going to give them that opportunity." The day of the final trial was clear and cool. Autumn in Plano was always my favorite time of year, the leaves turning golden and purple, the air fresh and clear. Margaret loved fall. Danon did too. I put on my only decent suit, the same one I'd worn to my son's wedding. I tied my tie with trembling hands. Today, everything was going to be decided. Today, the truth was going to prevail. Wilton picked me up, just like last time. In the car, he went over our files one more time. "The videotape of Phoebe's break-in is our trump card," he said, closing the folder. "It's not just proof of her dirty ways, it's proof that she knew the evidence against her existed and was trying to destroy it." I nodded, looking out the window at the streets floating by. Strangely, I didn't feel any hatred or even anger toward Phoebe, just tiredness and a longing for this to be over. "Do you think she'll show up in court?" I asked. "She has to," Wilton answered. "Her new lawyers are too expensive to just drop the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to file a motion to dismiss or offer a last-minute settlement." "I'm not taking any deals," I said firmly. "And you shouldn't," Wilton nodded. "The law is on our side." The courthouse was crowded. It appeared that our case had resonated in the small town. A lot of people knew our family, knew Danon. In the hallway, I spotted a few neighbors, Dr. Verwick, even a few of Danon's colleagues, including Rory. Phoebe arrived accompanied by her new legal team, two young men in impeccable suits with leather briefcases. She didn't glance in my direction, keeping a straight face with an expression of offended dignity. As Judge Hollingsworth entered the room and everyone took their seats, one of Phoebe's new lawyers, who introduced himself as Jeffrey Jameson, took the stand first. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to make a motion to dismiss for lack of subject matter." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain, Mr. Jameson." "My client, Mrs. Clayton, has received new information that has changed her perspective on the situation. She's prepared to accept the validity of the deed of gift and withdraw her suit, provided Mr. Clayton doesn't press charges of trespassing." Wilton immediately rose to the occasion. "Your Honor, my client will not agree to those terms. We insist on continuing the hearing and ruling on the merits of the case." The judge shifted his gaze to me. "Mr. Clayton, is that your position?" I stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. This isn't just about the house. This is about my son's last will and testament, which I am obligated to honor and protect." The judge nodded. "In that case, the motion is denied. Mr. Paxson, you may proceed with the presentation of your evidence." Wilton thanked the judge and called his last witness, a technician from the company that installed the security cameras in my house. "Mr. Jenkins, will you tell the court when and under what circumstances were surveillance cameras installed in Mr. Clayton's home?" The young man, nervously adjusting his tie, told how I went to their store, explained the situation, and asked them to install a rudimentary surveillance system. "It's a standard home security kit," he explained. "Wireless cameras with motion sensors, cloud storage." "And when exactly were these cameras installed?" 4 days before the break-in incident." "Thank you. Tell me, is it possible to tamper with or alter the footage from these cameras?" "No, sir. The system automatically records timestamps, and any tampering would be visible to forensics. In addition, all recordings are saved in encrypted form in cloud storage, access to which is password protected." Wilton thanked the witness and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to introduce the video of Mrs. Phoebe Clayton's unlawful entry into my client's home." The judge granted permission, and the surveillance video appeared on the screen in the courtroom. Everyone present saw Phoebe approach the back door of the house, look around, take out a tool, and begin to manipulate the lock. Then, already inside the house, she walked quickly through the kitchen straight to Danon's office, where she began frantically rifling through papers, pulling out drawers, going through folders, obviously looking for something. There was complete silence in the room. Even Phoebe's lawyers looked discouraged. She herself sat with her head down, hands clasped in her lap. "Your Honor," Wilton continued after the tape had ended, This videotape clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Clayton was aware of the existence of documents that threatened her position in this case and attempted to locate and likely destroy them. Not only is this a criminal offense for which she has already been charged, but it is also direct evidence of her bad faith in this civil proceeding. Jameson jumped up from his seat. Your Honor, we cannot comment on this record because we have not had an opportunity to review it in advance. We ask for a recess to consult with our client. The judge agreed to grant 15 minutes, and everyone in the trial left the room. In the hallway, I could see Phoebe and her attorneys talking animatedly about something off to the side. It was clear from their gestures and facial expressions that the conversation wasn't easy. When the trial resumed, Jameson looked noticeably less confident. Your Honor, given the new circumstances, my client is prepared to withdraw her lawsuit without conditions. The judge looked at Phoebe. Mrs. Clayton, do you affirm that ruling? Phoebe looked up, her eyes filled with defeat mixed with rage. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hollingsworth nodded. In that case, I'm ready to rule. The court recognizes the validity of a gift from Danon Clayton to his father, Earl Clayton. The house located at 123 Maple Street, Plano, Texas, is recognized as the property of Earl Clayton. The suit of Mrs. Phoebe Clayton is dismissed. Court costs are awarded to the plaintiff. He struck the gavel and the hall rumbled with muffled conversations. Phoebe jumped up from her seat, threw a searing glance in my direction, and quickly headed for the exit without waiting for her lawyers. Those hurried after her, gathering papers. Wilton put his hand on my shoulder. Congratulations, Earl. Justice had been served. I nodded, feeling strangely empty. The victory hadn't brought the joy I'd hoped for. After all, this battle wouldn't bring my son back to me. People came up to us. Neighbors, acquaintances, Danon's colleagues. They shook my hand, expressed their support, said they'd always known what a wonderful man Danon was and how glad they were that the truth had prevailed. Mr. Clayton, an elderly lady I vaguely remembered as a neighbor 2 houses down, approached me. I want to apologize. When Phoebe started spreading those awful rumors, I had my doubts. But now I see the kind of person she really is, and what your son was. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, I nodded. Dr. Verwick shook my hand firmly. Danon would be proud of you, Earl. You stood up to his last will and testament. Rory Balcom came up last. Mr. Clayton, I'm glad justice has been served. Danon would have been pleased. If you ever need help, any help, just give me a call. I thanked everyone, but felt drained and tired. Finally, when everyone had dispersed, Wilton and I walked out of the courthouse. What now? I asked, looking at the busy street in front of us. Now, Wilton answered. You go on with your life, Earl, just as Danon would have wanted you to. I walked back into the house that was now officially and irrevocably mine. It seemed so empty, so quiet. Danon's room, his study, his belongings all reminded me of the son I had lost, and yet I felt his presence, his support. The next weeks passed in peace and quiet. Phoebe never showed up again. Through her lawyers, she requested permission to take her personal belongings, and I agreed, but on the condition that she come accompanied by a bailiff. And so she did. Phoebe silently collected her belongings under the bailiff's watchful eye without a word to me. Gradually, life was falling into a new rut. I began sorting through my son's things, sorting through papers, photos, books. It was a painful but necessary process. I found some solace in it, like having one last conversation with Danon, one last chance to get to know him a little better through the traces he'd left behind. One day, while sorting through his desk, I found a folder with sketches of a project Danon had been working on shortly before his death. It was a plan to redevelop an old industrial neighborhood in Plano into an environmentally friendly area with affordable housing for students and young professionals. Danon always said that the city lacked affordable apartments for young people, especially community college students, many of whom had to spend hours commuting from neighboring towns. This finding got me thinking. Our house was too big for one person. The second floor, where Danon and Phoebe's bedrooms and guest room used to be, was empty. What if... The next day I called my old friend Harris Jennings, an architect with whom I had once worked in the construction business. "Harris, I have an idea and I need your advice." We met and I outlined my plan to him, to convert the second floor of the building into 3 small separate apartments for students, separate entrances, minimal renovations, and keeping the overall look of the house. "It's doable," Harris said after studying the layout. "It would require remodeling, separate utilities, permits, but it's doable. Are you sure you want to do this, Earl? Students can be noisy." "Noise is life, Harris," I replied. "This house has been quiet for too long. The paperwork and renovation process had taken months. It was spring when the work was done, and I was able to advertise the apartments." The first to respond was Kyle Neiman, an environmental science student from a local college. When he came in for an interview, I was struck by his resemblance to young Danon not in appearance, but in the way he spoke, in his passion for his work, in his genuine interest in environmental issues. "I'm working on a project to clean up the city's lake," he said with such enthusiasm that I smiled. "We are using a new biofiltration technology. If everything works out, it can be applied to other reservoirs." "My son was an environmental engineer," I said. "He would approve of your project." Kyle's eyes lit up. "Really?" I'd read several of Engineer Clayton's papers on industrial land reclamation. He was an innovator in the field. We talked for another hour about Danon's projects, about today's environmental issues, about how small decisions can lead to big changes. At the end of the conversation, I knew Kyle would be my first tenant. Soon others were found. Elisha Tanner, a history student, quiet and reserved but with sudden bursts of enthusiasm when the conversation turned to her major, and Vince McCoy, an information technology major, a bit scruffy but friendly and always willing to help with any computer or smartphone problems. The house filled with life. In the evenings there were often muffled voices from upstairs, laughter and sometimes music. Not too loud, my tenants were quite tactful. On weekends they would sometimes gather on my veranda and I would treat them to coffee and stories of old Plano. 6 months had passed since the trial. May was particularly warm and sunny, and the flowers in the garden, once planted by Margaret, were blooming profusely, filling the air with fragrance. On one such day, I received an unexpected letter from Rory Balcom. He wrote that he had accidentally bumped into Phoebe in Austin, where he was traveling to a conference. She was with a man she introduced as her fiancé, Gabriel Nook. They had, she said, moved to Austin a few months ago and were planning to open their own spiritual practice center. "Thought you should know," Rory wrote. She seemed quite content with her life, as if Danon had never existed. It upset me, but then I thought maybe it was for the best. She lives her life, we live ours. And Danon's memory stays with those who truly loved him. I folded the letter and decided it was time to visit my son. I took a bouquet of wildflowers, which he always preferred to lush roses, and drove to the cemetery. Danon's grave was well maintained. I came here every week, cutting the grass, removing leaves, sometimes just sitting there and telling him the news, as if my son could hear me. "Hi, son," I said, placing the flowers on the headstone. "I've got news. Do you remember Phoebe? She moved to Austin with that Gabriel guy. I hope they'll be happy, or get what they deserve. Either way, she's out of our lives." The wind rustled in the leaves of the trees as if it were an answer. "I also did something I think you'd like. Remember how you always said there wasn't enough student housing in town? I converted the second floor into apartments. There's 3 young guys living there now. One of them, Kyle, is an environmental studies major like you. He's working on a lake cleanup project. You'd approve. I was quiet, listening to the silence of the cemetery, broken only by bird song. Thank you, son, for everything, for protecting me even after you were gone, for being who you were. I miss you every day. But now I know I can move on. You gave me not only a roof over my head, but a new purpose to help young people like you always wanted. On the way back, I stopped by the college where I picked up Kyle after class. We agreed that I would show him some of Danon's old blueprints that might be useful for his project. On the way home, Kyle talked about his plans, his new water purification methods, and how important it was to preserve nature for future generations. I listened and smiled, thinking about how Danon would have said the same thing, probably in the same words. In the evening, sitting on the veranda with a cup of coffee, I looked up at the stars and thought about the strange twists and turns of fate, about how a loss can turn into a new beginning, about how my son, even after leaving, continued to care for me and even, in a way, guide my life. Now my house was once again filled with voices, laughter, and life boiling over. And though the pain of loss would never completely go away, I knew that Danon would have approved of my choices, approved that his home had become a haven for those who strove for knowledge and a better future, as he himself had once done. That night, for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a light heart, without nightmares or troubling thoughts. I dreamed of Danon, smiling, calm, standing on the lake shore with a fishing rod, just like when we used to go fishing on weekends as kids. He turned to me and said, "That's right, Dad. It's just the way it's supposed to be." When I woke up in the morning, I felt peaceful. Life went on. Not the same life as before, but still a life in which there was room for both the memory of the past and hope for the future. From upstairs came the muffled voices of my tenants going to class. I went upstairs to make coffee. The day promised to be good, and so did all the days that followed. I no longer felt like a lonely old man lost in a house that was too big. I was a man with a purpose, with a new family, not by blood, but by spirit. And I knew that Danon, wherever he was now, approved of that. Every evening, sitting on the veranda, I would mentally talk to my son, telling him about my business, my new charges, as I called the students, my plans for the future. And though he could not answer, I felt his presence in every corner of the house, in every rustle of leaves in the garden, in every ray of sunlight coming through the window. His last gift, this house, was not just a defense against Phoebe's greed, but a new beginning for me, a life where I could carry on my son's work, helping young people, giving them a piece of the wisdom and kindness I'd once invested in Danon. And when Kyle, excited and happy, came running in to tell me that his lake cleanup project had been approved and a grant had been awarded for implementation, I felt that somewhere out there, beyond our comprehension, Danon was smiling at the sight of it all. Life went on, and there was still room in it for love, hope, and new beginnings, even for a 67-year-old widower who had lost his only son. Sometimes, sitting in the quiet of my room, I would reread Danon's journal, tracing his journey from happy newlywed to disappointed husband, from trusting man to one who had to make a difficult decision to protect his father. And each time, I thanked him for that final gift, not only for the house, but for the lesson of love and care he taught me by his act. Phoebe and her new fiancé faded into the distance, as if they had never been in our lives. I'd heard that their spiritual practice center in Austin wasn't doing well. Too much competition, too little real substance. But I didn't care about that. I didn't wish them harm, but I didn't wish them well, either, just that they lived their lives, far away from me and the memory of Danon. I, on the other hand, had found a new vocation. In addition to renting apartments to students, I started helping Kyle with his environmental project, not as a specialist, of course, but as a person with experience in construction and organization. We went to the lake together, discussed the layout of the biofilters, and I advised him on how to interact with contractors. "You remind me of my grandfather," Kyle once said. "He too was always willing to help, to share his experience. Thanks to people like you, young people have someone to learn from." Those words touched me to the core. I had never thought of myself as someone to learn from. But now, in this new chapter of my life, I began to realize that decades of experience can indeed be useful to someone else. Elisha, my history student, often asked me to tell her what Plano was like in the 60s and 70s. She recorded my memories for her oral history project on the city, and Vince helped me master the computer and smartphone at a level I'd never dreamed of before. We became a strange but tight-knit family, not related by blood but united by a common home and mutual support. I cooked for them on weekends. They helped me with the hard work in the garden. We celebrated holidays, birthdays, successful exams together. And every day I felt more and more strongly that I had found my place in life. That everything that had happened, the loss of Danon, the struggle with Phoebe, the discovery of the truth, had brought me to a point where I could become not just a lonely old man living out his days, but a man still capable of doing something meaningful, still capable of loving and supporting others. That day, exactly 6 months after the final court hearing, I drove to the cemetery again. I took Kyle with me. He'd been asking for a long time, saying he wanted to meet Danon, to honor the man whose work had inspired his choice of profession. We stood at the grave and I talked about my son, his childhood, his youth, his professional accomplishments. Kyle listened with genuine interest, sometimes asking questions. "You know, Mr. Clayton," he said when I stopped talking, "I think your son would be glad that his home lives on, that it still has room for dreamers and those who want to make the world a better place." "I think you're right, Kyle," I replied, looking at the headstone. Danon had always been a generous man. He knew how to share not only things, but knowledge, inspiration, support. We fell silent, listening to the bird song and the rustling of leaves. Danon's last gift, I finally said, was more than just a home. It was an opportunity to start a new life, to continue what was important to him, helping others, caring for nature, creating a community of like-minded people. Kyle nodded and placed the small stone he'd brought with him, a smooth, water-polished river-naked stone, on the grave. "It's from the shore of the lake we're cleaning up," he explained. "I thought he'd like to know that his ideas live on." On the way home, we stopped at a plant nursery and bought some seedlings for the garden. Danon had always wanted to plant more trees there, but kept putting it off for a future he didn't have. In the evening, all my tenants gathered in the backyard and we planted the trees together. Elisha suggested naming each one after someone we had lost but wanted to remember. The first tree, of course, became Danon. The second one I named Margaret. Kyle, Elisha, and Vince also found names for the rest of the saplings. Looking at these young people planting trees that will probably outlive them, I realized that this is what life is all about, creating something that will be left behind, passing on your wisdom to the next generation, being a link between the past and the future. Danon gave me more than just a house. He gave me a new purpose and meaning in life, and for that, I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life.